Tonight, we won't count emperors on thrones or trace the lines of forgotten decrees. Instead, we'll enter a city where domes catch the last fire of the sun and alleys hide the smell of yesterday's market. Constantinople was built to impress armies and pilgrims alike. Walls layered like stone armor, gates that promised triumph, and mosaics where saints stared forever with unblinking eyes. But life within those walls carried a different weight. Rats scurried beneath arches of marble. Bread was measured grain by grain, and faith wrapped itself around fear like smoke around incense. Here, emperors processed beneath canopies of silk, while children tapped coins against wagon wheels to test their worth. Here, glory and grime were neighbors, and survival meant learning to walk slowly between the two. So lower the lights. Let the sound of trumpets and the murmur of markets mingle softly in your thoughts. And if your breathing begins to fall in step with the rhythm of sandals echoing through colonnades, that is just the city drawing you into its endless procession. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next mosaic glowing in candlelight will be waiting for you there. And from that faint glow, the city opens further. Behind the marble gates and gilded icons, life was not wrapped in gold, but in dust, sweat, and survival. The Byzantines walked streets that shimmered in ceremony, yet smelled of the fish market. To understand Constantinople, you must look beyond the domes and banners, into the baths where water turned to sickness, the kitchens where bread was weighed against hunger, and the alleys where survival whispered louder than faith. Constantinople greeted most noses with something closer to wet wool and old olives. The famous Golden Gate, a triumphal arch of pale stone, gleamed as if it had been polished by angels with soft cloths. And if you squinted from a distance, it promised a city that never produced crumbs. Up close, the arch had pigeons. The birds were small and ambitious and used the imperial masonry as a formal dining room. Guides assured visitors that the gates symbolized victory, the pigeons symbolized continuity. The city wasn't in a hurry either. Its streets wandered like someone searching for a misplaced sandal. They were narrow and lively and theoretically drained by channels that behaved more like suggestions than infrastructure. On hot afternoons, a cartwheel squelched politely. People stepped carefully, like dancers trained by generations of caution. A gentleman's slipper might be embroidered with gold, but the path beneath it remembered last night's fish market. The great walls, layered like a cake baked by a careful ant, kept out armies with terrifying efficiency. The alleys, layered like a smaller cake, kept out the idea of walking quickly. It is the kind of urban paradox that helps you relax. Enormous stone confidence in one direction, domestic confusion in another. The Byzantines loved ceremony. They adored the idea that life could be choreographed. Processions moved like rivers made of brocade. Trumpets, Byzantine ones, bright and nasal, said that everything was in order. The emperor moved beneath a canopy that could shade a vineyard, and courtiers wore shoes dyed purple with a recipe guarded so closely that even the dye probably didn't know it. Then you would turn a corner and discover a cat sleeping on a pile of turnips while two men argued about the price of rope. A clerk measured grain with a wooden scoop that had seen better decades. A woman purchased onions one at a time and tucked them into a sleeve. And in the shade of a colonnade where saints stared from mosaics with gentle, unblinking eyes, a child counted coins using a method that was basically tapping them on a wagon wheel and listening to the sound. It was a city of dazzling illusions and very practical truths. The palace glowed with gold leaf. The baker's paddle glowed with heat. Someone had to stand between the two and pretend this was consistent. That someone was usually everyone. Luxury had a habit of clustering the way raisins cluster in a loaf. Exciting when you find one, and then suddenly you realize they're all on one side. A senator's home might have a fountain indoors, which is convenient if you enjoy the sound of carefully trained water. He would drop a little bronze fish into the pool for luck and call the trickle philosophical. The marble under his feet came from a quarry so far away that a camel still felt tired about it. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood politely described as near the pottery, a family ate their supper on a bench attached to the wall so it wouldn't to walk away. They hung a spoon on a nail to keep it cleanish. If asked to describe their diet, they would say yes. The emperor hosted banquets where sweet wine was poured into cups that had opinions about sunlight. At the same time, a dock worker chewed a fig like a man negotiating with fate. The city loved bread more than it loved philosophy, which is fair because bread keeps better in a cupboard than an argument. People spoke gratefully of the annona, the grain dole, in the tone you might reserve for a dependable uncle. Barges brought wheat through the Bosporus, wind permitting, taxation cooperating, storms feeling cooperative. On a good day, the ovens were so busy that the city smelled like a warm pocket. On a bad day, the queues of the baker looked like an improvised festival without music. It's charming to imagine that the rich and poor met in the same public squares. They did, of course, in the way that two ships meet by passing in opposite directions and commenting on the weather. A noble might glide past with an entourage of thoughtful slippers. A porter moved in the opposite direction carrying amphoras that had constituted their own workout program since the reign of Constantine. Somewhere in the middle walked a scribe hunched over a wax tablet, writing the word for mud in several different moods. Wealth in Constantinople was a rumor you could hear by listening to the click of jewelry in church or the quiet in the pantry. Hunger was quieter still. It made people efficient. A spoonful of lentils became a strategy. A crust of bread became a negotiation with the future. And yet the city kept lighting lamps against the night, as if to assure itself that the differences all belonged to one household. Bathing, they said, was health. And the city agreed enthusiastically, building bathhouses the way modern cities build coffee shops. If you needed gossip, you went to the baths. If you needed a business partner, you went to the baths. If you needed to find your cousin's lost sandal, somehow it would be there, floating like a philosophical statement. Water steamed, conversation steamed, noses steamed. The hippocausts, those underfloor furnaces, sighed like dragons with excellent manners. Attendants scraped skin with strigils in long, methodical arcs, collecting a gentle mixture of oil, dust, and the previous hour's adventures. It was hygienic in theory, sociable in practice, and, from the point of view of microorganisms, a well-attended festival. Doctors wrote about humors with brisk confidence. Too much black bile, they advised, can make a person melancholic. Too much street, a later commentator might add, can make anyone sneeze. The bathhouse served fermented beverages at the door, which helped patrons enjoy the idea of health, and also the idea of another cup. If you had a rash, someone had a salve. If you had a cough, someone knew a saint. If you had neither, someone would lend you both so you wouldn't feel left out. The city liked remedies that sounded like recipes and recipes that sounded like remedies. A pleasant confusion that produced soups and poultices of similar texture. Physicians with admirable beards recommended garlic for vigor, vinegar for balance, and prayer for everything else. The apothecary's jars were labeled in Greek so artistic that you felt better while reading them. The public fountains, carved with dolphins that never swam anywhere, delivered water to anyone with a bucket and patience. On hot days, the queue curled around the square like a friendly snake. You could learn half the city's news while progressing 5 steps. A grandmother advised a bride on the correct way to wash linen, which is the same as the correct way to wash almost anything, with attention. Somewhere, a monk wrote moderation in a manuscript, underlining it twice with a small sigh. Food, in ordinary months, was simple enough to remember in your sleep. Bread, wine, olives, a respectful cameo by dried fish, and occasionally something confident like goat. The bread was mostly brown and frequently excellent, its crumbs sighing when broken. Bakers baked at dawn because ovens dislike sleeping in, and loaves went to market while the sun rehearsed. Wine was diluted in the sensible ancient way, which makes afternoons both longer and shorter. People dipped bread in oil as if signing a contract. Beans performed their humble, reliable work. Cheese appeared like a friend with good timing. On feast days, the table learned new vocabulary, honeyed pastries, sesame seeds, a stew that had obviously been thinking for hours. Then there were the seasons when the rain forgot its lines, or arrived all at once. The empire knew the choreography of scarcity. Warehouses were full until they were mostly echo, and suddenly the color of the baker's queue changed from cheerful to attentive. The city had mechanisms for this: price edicts, appeals to the provinces, prayers in complicated Greek. A bishop preached that bread begins in heaven as an intention. A clerk wrote that bread begins in a ledger as an entry. A mother taught that bread begins in a small pair of hands, learning what enough flour looks like, which is frankly the most accurate definition available. In hungry weeks, onions did heroic work. They made soups taste like decisions. A few anchovies pounded into a paste convinced the pot it had depth. You learned to savor patience, which has a flavor surprisingly close to time. And you learned to imagine. People described pears that were not present with such tenderness that you could almost peel the adjective. It is restful, in a way, to know that even a great capital could be reduced to the same arithmetic as a village. How many loaves today? And tomorrow? And what can we pretend tastes like more? The empire's laws appeared calm and illuminated, like manuscript pages where each letter wears a gold halo. But punishment preferred practical results. Blinding had a bureaucratic efficiency that modern office managers might admire. It removed political rivalry without producing the paperwork of an execution. The procedure was wrapped in ceremony and sometimes mercy, which is to say, it was performed in a way that allowed chroniclers to write about it while clearing their throats. Branding announced a crime permanently, as if the skin were a state archive. Someone sentenced to exile might carry, on his face, minutes from an unpleasant meeting he had once had with the law. It is characteristic of Byzantium that even harshness had a tone of administration. Forms were filed. Witnesses were consulted. The gospel was quoted in a voice of deep, slow grammar. You might think you wouldn't last a day because of the punishments. In truth, you might not last the morning because of the paperwork before them. Castration, the spectator will observe from a distance and with one's legs crossed, was a frequent political solution. Eunuchs served at court with remarkable success. They became masters of ceremony, logisticians of imperial patience, choreographers of protocol. If the empire was a clock, they kept time. The practice is not charming, but the resulting competence often was. In palaces where curtains were as authoritative as walls, eunuchs knew how far a bow should travel and when an incense burner should exhale. When an ambassador asked a complicated question, a eunuch answered two simpler ones instead, which is an underrated diplomatic art. Every empire chooses its efficiencies. The Byzantine one chose several that feel like footnotes written in bold. When people were not in church or at work or at the baths, they were at the races. The hippodrome stretched like a stone ladle, scooping people by the tens of thousands. Teams had colors, blues and greens most famous, reds and whites as respectable ancestors, and citizens swore family loyalty to pigments with the seriousness usually reserved for saints. A charioteer could be a superstar and also an instrument of municipal policy. The starting gates rattled, the crowd hummed, and horses performed their athletic philosophy around the spina, the track's central divider decorated with statues that had traveled farther than most spectators ever would. Someone ate almonds by the handful. Someone else explained to a bored nephew that Emperor so-and-so once sat exactly here and glared meaningfully at a senator. Then, sometimes, the city remembered that excitement is like yeast. It can be helpful, or it can make the whole loaf try to escape the pan. A grievance began about taxes. It found a megaphone in the stands. It became a riot with opinions about urban planning. The famous Nika riot started as team rivalry and turned into a week-long urban critique, written accidental fire. People looked up, surprised to see buildings arguing back. Justinian nearly left the city. Theodora reminded him that purple makes a good burial shroud. Generals reminded the crowd that quiet has virtues. Later, the streets were swept, the stones were laid, and the city returned to its routine of buying onions and discussing theology at an advanced level. Microhistory lesson, gently inserted and then tucked away again. In Byzantium, entertainment and politics shared a closet, and their clothes were always mixed up. Everywhere, faith threaded through daily life like gold wire in a tapestry. You could kneel before a small icon painted on wood and feel watched in the kindest possible way. The saints stood timelessly still, and you stood almost still, and for a brief minute the city quieted enough to hear your own breath. Miracles were catalogued with a clerk's precision. A fever lifted after a candle was lit, a ship arrived against a contrary wind. A lost child discovered in a place no one had thought to look usually under a bench, because children are consistent across centuries. Skeptics existed, of course, but skepticism in Byzantium behaved politely and often wore a cassock. Holy men used olive oil as medicine and also as theology. Pilgrims arrived from the provinces carrying bread in a cloth and questions in a pocket. They traded both, happily. Relics filled reliquaries in shapes that resembled the idea of a city made of gleaming brass. A fragment of bone, a splinter of wood, a veil, anything that could be associated with the sacred, was carefully nested like a bird. A sag and carried in procession while the sun adjusted its angle to watch. A physician prescribed fasting for a patient with a stubborn illness. The patient combined it with a visit to an icon known for listening well. You could call this double entry bookkeeping of the soul. In the morning, people argued about horse teams. At noon, they argued about the nature of Christ with vocabularies as precise as a jeweler's tools. The arguments sometimes turned physical, but more often they simply turned into longer arguments. The empire had entire seasons devoted to clarifying a single preposition in Greek. It is hard not to find that soothing. Words got their temperature taken, then their pulse. Because ideas had weight, icons did too. The empire went through periods when paintings of holy figures were honored with kisses, and periods when those same paintings were removed in tidy, sorrowful batches. Iconoclast emperors said images confused the faithful. Iconophile monks said images taught the illiterate, which was many people and offended no one. An artisan who once painted a saint might suddenly paint a basket of fruit with similar devotion, which is why medieval pear portraits occasionally look more meditative than you expect. A bishop wrote letters in which the word veneration showed up so often it began to sound like a neighbor. An empress argued gently, persuasively, and sometimes successfully that beauty was a pathway to truth. Meanwhile, a shopkeeper adjusted a little portrait above his counter to face the doorway, which improved sales in ways both spiritual and measurable. The daily fear, when people whispered about heresy, was not lions or dungeons, it was discretion. You might speak too eagerly or bow too deeply or fail to bow at all. So the city developed a choreography of cautious piety. Cross yourself, yes, but with an angle that matched the company. Praise the emperor, absolutely, but quote a homily while doing it so your praise looked like learning. At home, mothers taught children to kiss the icon gently so as not to smudge the paint, which is the same advice museum docents offer now, only with more signs. If you lived there, you would not last a day for many small reasons rather than one grand one. Your shoes would be wrong, either too soft for the cobbles or too loud for the church. You would forget to carry small change for the beggar with the sharpest memory in the quarter. You would arrive at the baths without your own oil and be obliged to borrow some that smelled faintly of cumin. You would order wine at a tavern, and the owner, who had been diluting his pitchers since the Council of Chalcedon, would smile gently as if to say, "We all understand the rules." You would misread the bread queue and stand in the fish queue for 20 minutes, which is an educational experience of an entirely different sort. You would watch a procession pass and step 1 foot too far into the street, becoming a minor hazard to a thoroughbred horse who has read more ceremonies than you have. You would try to greet a monk with the wrong honorific and receive a parable in return, a fair exchange, but a long one. The city would not reject you. It would simply tire you into acceptance. And then, just as you were ready to give up, evening would arrive with that soft Aegean light polishing the very edges of stone. The sea would turn the color of cool metal. Lamps would lift little bowls of fire into the dusk. Someone would sing a psalm with a voice made of straight lines, and you would understand what the Byzantines understood. That beauty, arranged carefully enough, can outlast irritation. The baker slid tomorrow's loaves into the oven. The cats settled into shapes that resembled punctuation. A mother folded a cloth with so much concentration it became a kind of prayer. The hippodrome, empty now, waited like a sleeping amphora. Somewhere in a quiet corner of the palace, a scribe sharpened a reed pen, tapped the nib against his thumb, and began another line. Morning would come again with its tidy errands and sloppy corners. A saint's feast might add a sprig of laurel to someone's doorway. A fisherman would test the smell of wind with a nose that knew more algebra than parchment ever could. At a fountain, women would compare prices in the tone of philosophers discovering a new planet. A notary would copy a contract about a vineyard on a hillside that looked down at the sea and pretended not to. The emperor, wherever he happened to be that day, would decide something in Greek while a eunuch provided the commas. In the market, a boy would try to teach a puppy the concept of stay using only breadcrumbs and optimism. The puppy, like empires, would obey intermittently. Life in Constantinople was one long negotiation between grandeur and puddles, between purple and mud. It worked not because either side won, but because both kept showing up, day after day, century after century, with slightly better shoes and a few more recipes. If you're somehow still with me, you can subscribe, or you can simply let the lamps of the old city dim into your eyelids. Imagine the Golden Gate again, not the smell, just the stone catching late light, a color inventive for slow breathing. The pigeons settle, the water in the baths grows quiet. The bread cools on the rack and the whole city smells like patience. A bell counts the hours, not urgently, one and then another, spaced like deep, careful breaths. And somewhere a clerk finally writes the Greek word for enough, puts down his pen and closes the page without a sound. You might not expect a city called New Rome to begin the day with the sound of brooms against marble and the smell of fish that left the market hours ago. But Constantinople liked to layer grandeur with leftovers. The Golden Gate, white and confident, promised order like a well-pressed tunic, and then a cart rattled past it with a cargo of turnips and 3 unsupervised chickens, and the promise relaxed a little. From far away, the walls looked like a line drawn with a ruler. From near at hand, the alleys looked like a signature written by a person who had never met a ruler in their life. If you're still awake when we reach the bathhouse etiquette, you can subscribe or not. I will assume you did and be thrilled either way. The streets worked in a complicated harmony, water sellers calling out politely, cats calling out less politely, a priest rehearsing tomorrow's hymn under his breath, and a saddler's apprentice explaining to no one how long a good strap should last. On clear mornings, sunlight set the gilded domes to glowing and persuaded visitors that the city was made of gold leaf and excellent intentions. A minute later, a boy stepped in something that had not been mentioned by the guidebook, wiped his sandal on a doorstep that had also not been mentioned by the guidebook, and went on. Pigeons ran the logistics of the main squares with a passion for crumbs that borders on theological. A court official drifted past in soft purple shoes dyed with a recipe guarded as if it were doctrine. A porter limped in the opposite direction with amphoras of oil, and every step sounded like a contract. The two worlds existed a hand's breadth apart. That is the city's favorite trick. The palace at one end of your gaze, a broom at the other, and the sense that both are permanent. Luxury staged itself with a talent for theater. Courtiers ate honeyed cakes that pretended to be fruit, and sometimes fruit that pretended to be jewels, while a cobbler in the next quarter counted his lunch in olives rather than pieces of bread. A senator installed a fountain indoors, a small obedient river that performed for guests, and swallowed a bronze coin when they asked nicely. An ordinary family, if they owned anything that splashed, owned a bucket. And yet the same breeze touched everyone's face. The city's wealth had a geography, villas on the breezy ridges, tenements in the earnest low ground, warehouses that smelled like the answer to a riddle involving tar. Markets divided themselves by soundfish clattering, wool whispering, metal speaking in the clear syllables of hammer and anvil. The baker's queue meandered with civic patience. Loaves wore stamps like official documents, win the battle, said some, and more practically, paid the tax, said others. Bread was policy and also comfort, and most days there was enough of it to keep nervousness at a simmer rather than a boil. In churches bright with mosaics, rich and poor stood shoulder to shoulder under saints who never blinked. A noble could run a miracle for his family by commissioning a lamp. A widow could sponsor a prayer with a candle that sputtered bravely. The city's contradictions were not a mistake. They were the ingredients. You learned to look at marble and mud in the same breath and nod, as if someone had just explained a good joke, and you were saving the laugh for later. That is probably how you would survive the morning, by filing the grand things under "oh," and the small things under "of course." Bathing offered relief, conversation, and a useful way to share whatever your neighbors were sharing. The bathhouse entrances had stone benches worn smooth by backs that had decided to rest for exactly 5 minutes more. Fees were modest, opinions were free, and steam was abundant. You undressed behind a screen that did not quite understand its purpose, handed your clothes to a boy who could fold them into a tidier life than you owned, and stepped into warmth that felt like being agreed with. Attendants anointed with oil and scraped with strigils, gathering a glossy mixture of sweat and dust that, according to one cheerful source, was once bottled and sold as a tonic. People discussed racing teams and theology with equal confidence. Someone with a cough spoke the names of herbs as if they were relatives. The physician, if he visited, wore the expression of a man who had seen the 4 humors loitering outside and was waiting for them to go home. Water pipes thumped, hypocaust fires breathed, and 100 conversations drifted toward the ceiling like banners. It was health in theory and community in practice, which is why epidemics walked through the doors like regulars. Public latrines did their civic best, but filth traveled faster than policy and into corners that did not get swept until tomorrow. People tied amulets to their children and advice to their sleeves. Hand-washing existed, though the soap was shy, and the best disinfectant was usually distance hard to achieve in a city that preferred company. When you left the baths, your skin gleamed, your lungs had met every cough in the district, and your head buzzed with rumors accurate enough to be interesting and inaccurate enough to keep the day pleasantly soft around the edges. Food was simple, reverent, and almost mathematical. Bread plus wine equaled lunch. Bread plus wine plus olives equaled something to look forward to. Beans were honest. On feast days, sesame, honey, and a little cinnamon did the work of joy. Most households lived one harvest from worry, a distance measured in loaves rather than months. Bakers rose at hours when even saints rolled over, stoked ovens like small suns, and slid round loaves onto paddles with a motion so calm it qualified as prayer. Water sellers announced their route. measuring out coolness with brass cups that chime like small bells. Fish arrived wrapped in stories about how difficult they had been to catch, which are the oldest species in the sea. Wine was mixed with water politely and on purpose, because the ancients preferred length to intensity. Cheese happened when luck met milk. Dried figs happened when summer met patience. Then came the seasons when rain misbehaved, and the grain ships from the Black Sea did not. Prices developed opinions. The queue at the bakery became a daily weather report written in faces. The prefect posted edicts about fair measures and fair prices, and sent inspectors to check the scales with little weights that looked like toys and carried the weight of law. Relief barges finally nosed into the harbor, and the city exhaled as if it had been holding its breath since Tuesday. In the meantime, onions were heroic, garlic persuasive, and herbs a reminder that even thin soups can be aromatic if you talk to them kindly. People told each other recipes that had not changed for 1,000 years. There is nothing as steadying as a recipe you can remember even when you are tired. And the whole city, tired or not, remembered bread. Justice, when it arrived, were a clerk's handwriting. The empire favored solutions that left a person alive and very sure he would not apply for the job again. Blinding was administration by other means, the removal of a rival without the creation of a martyr, and the chroniclers could record it with solemn faces and an air of unfortunate necessity. Branding wrote a history on the skin that could be read from a distance. Thief, rebel, exile footnotes a person carried to market. Castration built a successful civil service. Eunuchs organized the palace with a precision that resembled kindness. Ceremonies obeyed them. Audiences formed and dissolved at their nod. Secrets recognized them as their landlord. The courts themselves were careful theater. Witnesses recited events at a pace that made everyone reconsider the value of time. Testimony stacked itself like cushions. The judge peered over a desk piled with law that had begun in Rome and was still walking. You would not last a day if you demanded simplicity. Byzantium liked nuance the way a jeweler likes small stones. Then there was the hippodrome, where the city forgot nuance and remembered enthusiasm. Chariots thundered. Colors mattered blues and greens most fiercely, and men who could not agree on bread prices agreed instantly on a hero with a good seat on a 4-horse team. The Spina down center displayed statues that had traveled more widely than their spectators. Bets were made with glances, with finger taps, with a friend's elbow. Cheerfulness could become grievance quickly. Grievance, given stares and a crowd, could become the kind of riot that leaves historians with a lot of verbs. The famous week when Nika rolled like surf through the city ended in ash and rebuilding, and a new understanding that sport may be sport until it is suddenly policy. On ordinary days, however, a crushed almond, a rag of team color tied to a wrist, and a good shout were all anyone carried home. The city preferred its passions bracketed by bread. Faith ran under everything like a buried conduit. You met it in the way light pulled on tesserae in a church at noon, and in the way a fisherman made the sign of the cross over his nets as if he were opening a book. Miracles were listed with calm detail, a fever lowered after a vow, a voyage completed against a contrary wind, a child recovered from a well with a story about angels that grew more precise every telling. Skeptics existed and drank quietly in corners, but even they lit candles when the sea looked unfriendly. Relics rested in boxes shaped like the idea of treasure. A sliver of wood, a fragment of bone, a veil each kept in a reliquary that made modest things look eternal. Procession stitched neighborhoods together with incense. A chronicler noted that the choir sounded like silver. A baker noted that the path to his oven had been blocked politely for an hour. The empire argued about images with the patience of scholars and the energy of people who actually cared. During iconoclast years, saints left the walls and rested in storerooms. During iconophile years, they returned to their places and received so many kisses that paint were thin of the lips. An artisan who once painted a martyr learned to paint vines, and the vines learned to look slightly holy. The lines between piety and fear were fine. People worried about demons with the same seriousness they worried about taxes. Mothers hung little blue beads against the evil eye beside the door and reminded their children not to mention good fortune loudly, in case fortune was listening and disliked compliments. Confessors spoke with the gravity of men who knew what secrets weighed. Sin was not abstract. It was a thing with edges. And hell, described from the pulpit with exact adjectives, felt as close as tomorrow. But hope was close too. When the lampadas were lit at dusk, little bowls of fire caught in the brass like tame stars. The city breathed out through its arches. A deacon arranged a cloth on the altar as if smoothing an argument. Somewhere, a widow counted out coins for bread and put aside 2 for a candle. By evening, the great walls looked like the back of a sleeping animal. The sea laid itself down against the stones. Voices thinned to strands, a mother calling a child, a sailor calling a friend, a bell announcing now, and then now again. In a courtyard, a man rinsed his hands at a jar while his wife arranged the bowls. Somewhere else, the emperor listened to a eunuch read the orders for tomorrow in a voice the size of a key. The baths exhaled their last cloud. Cats rearranged themselves into commas. The baker stamped tomorrow's loaves and shut the door with the soft finality of a day completed. You might think you wouldn't last a day here because of the punishments, or the cues, or the theology that switches languages mid-sentence. In truth, the part that would wear you down is the persistence. Emperors, ovens, icons, races, edicts, rain, taxes, candles, the cycle asks you to keep showing up. The city is not cruel, it is continuous. If you have drifted a little, that is all right. The hippodrome is dark. The Golden Gate holds its pale line in the moonlight, and the pigeons practice sleeping. A night watchman taps his staff against stone, once for the hour, once for company, and the sound travels the length of a block like a slow thought. Lamps gutter, then decide not to. The Bosporus moves like breathing that has found its pace, and the whole city, shining and shabby, lays its head down together until the first bread is slid into the first oven and New Rome wakes with the ordinary miracle of having done this all before and being willing calmly, almost sleepily, to do it again. You might not expect a city that called itself New Rome to smell faintly of warm bread and damp rope at dawn, but Constantinople liked to begin the day with ordinary things and then add gold on top like a garnish. The Golden Gate sat there pretending to be the front door of the world. It had that calm, self-aware marble confidence. A trumpeter on the wall tried a few notes that the Gauls did not review kindly. If you're still awake when I reach the part about the bathhouse scraper, feel free to subscribe or nap or both. The streets below were already moving, not rushing. Shuffling forward like a long thought, porters carried amphoras that chimed softly as if the jars were clearing their throats. A man selling onions announced his onions as if they were a recent discovery. A scribe unrolled a little desk on his knees and wrote a receipt that looked like a tiny miracle. Then the sun lifted and the illusion arrived on schedule. Domes caught light as if they had rehearsed. Mosaics turned from stone to honey. From the hilltops you could pretend the city was made entirely of order. From the alleys you could tell at once that rats had a union and sewage had a personality. That is the trick of the place. It could be both at once without apologizing. A senator stepped out under a portico, the solace of his purple shoes whispering about a dye so rare it had a biography. 20 steps away, a cooper rinsed a barrel in water that had made several other plans before this. A pilgrim stared at the bronze horses on the hippodrome and forgot to breathe. A fishmonger arranged mullet into a fan and remembered to shout. Pigeons supervised everything. They seemed to own the squares legally. The basilica lamps still flickered from the night, as if the dark had not quite signed its paperwork. Bread lines formed without impatience. The loaves were stamped seals the way citizens wore names. Some stamps praised emperors, others praised mills. Either way, the impression remained on the crust like a memo. People compared crumbs by weight with an expertise that felt civic. In palaces, a fountain murmured in a room where fountains did not belong, which is how you know you are in a capital. In the tenements, a pitcher stood under a drip that never gave up, which is how you know you are in a port. Visitors lost track of what was rare and what was normal. This was normal: marble next to mud, a bishop's cloak glancing a mule's flank, a saint's relic passing a pickle barrel, and no one thinking the order was odd. You would wash because everyone washed, and you would catch what everybody caught because everyone also did that. The bathhouse door had a stone threshold polished by a century of undecided feet. You paid a small fee to a man with the expression of a patient cashier. Inside, steam made everything charitable. Oil boys ran a quiet economy. They rubbed, scraped, and nodded the nods of men who had heard every race result and every rumor about the next patriarch. You lay on hot stone that felt like a compliment. A strigil, just a curved piece of metal with big dreams, kissed off sweat and dust and yesterday. The mixture gathered in a bowl that a few optimistic physicians later recommended as medicine. An attendant demonstrated lunges not because they helped, but because they looked decisive. And the tepid room politics loosened its collar. Blues and greens explained why their driver was better at not dying. A merchant listed prices of pepper like the verses of a psalm. An elderly man swore the air here cured melancholy if you visited often enough and believed enough, and also did not eat melons after sunset. The doctor, when he visited, discussed humors as if they paid rent, which they did. On good weeks, the baths were half attached to architecture. On bad weeks, there were rumors with plumbing. Germs rode heat the way courtiers rode news. A cough did not stay private for long. You left rosy, scented, and freshly informed, which is 3 victories, and also carrying several tiny strangers who promised to introduce themselves tomorrow. Food waited outside, sensible and repetitive in the comforting way of lullabies. Bread and wine were the chorus. Olives, cheese, beans, leeks, the verses. Fish arrived with eyes that had opinions. On fast days, there was confidence in fish. On feast days, confidence and honey cakes that pretended to be little domes. Wine was mixed with water because the city preferred longevity to adventure. You could taste fields in it, and the conversation of amphoras. Most households lived close to the edge of the ledger. One bad storm, and the grain ships from the Black Sea went home sulking. Then prices developed personalities. The prefects sent inspectors who carried little bronze weights like modest gods. A baker who shaved his measures might find his shop mentioned by name in a very public place. Bread stamps became delicate law. Children learned to read by reading crests. When relief finally pushed through the straits, the harbor breathed like a chest untying a knot. People turned again to onions and leftover confidence. And the day kept going because it always did. Law here liked to be precise and also theatrical. It could forgive and still make an example. Punishments were careful instruments. Blinding created fewer martyrs than executions and more job openings than acquittals. Chroniclers wrote about it the way one writes about rainfall. Branding turned skin into a marginal note that courts could read at a distance. A thief wore his commentary, a rebel wore his footnote. Eunuchs, great experts in palace corridors, remembered everything and forgot nothing. They walked as if moving furniture with their minds. A nod from one could adjust a calendar. Imperial ceremonies, which were not events so much as weather, arranged themselves around them. The court itself was sentences inside sentences. If you listened long enough, you could hear Rome humming underneath. A judge might quote a law older than the city, and then pause so the city could consider how modern it felt. You would tire of the paper before the pen did. and then the hippodrome would reset every principle back to loud. 4 teams once, but 2 mattered now, and they mattered in the way that colors matter to flags. Blues and greens were identities, families, arguments that walked. Drivers became saints of speed. A good start felt liturgical. Shouts knitted themselves into one voice. Banners wrinkled like impatient sky. The spina down the center stared back with statues taken from everywhere. Bets were a finger language. A man tapped the inside of his wrist, and someone else understood a number. Victory rounds sprayed fragments of laurel and opinions. All of this felt safe until it wasn't. The city remembered the week the cheer turned to Nika, and then to fire. The way one syllable can pull a thread and a whole robe follows it off the body. After that, officials stood near stairs and counted a little faster. Most days, though, the circus ended in cheerfulness and dust, and people went home with a throat that felt wider and a pocket that felt lighter. Justice returned to its handwriting. The Empire preferred continuity. It liked its edges sharp and its afternoons predictable. You would not last a day if you insisted on clean endings. The city loved footnotes. It loved compromises that remembered insults and then folded them carefully for later. Faith held the roof up. It also rattled the shutters. You could hear it in the way a choir warmed its vowels like spoons over coals. You could see it in mosaics that caught light like clever fishing nets. Relics slept in boxes shaped like promises. A fragment of a saint's finger would travel in procession under a canopy that made the sky look politely interested. People kissed the glass that covered icons until the paint wore thin at the lips, which is why restorers knew where the love lived. Miracles were logged with the neatness of shipping receipts. Fever abated on 3rd day after vow. Child recovered on account of prayer plus vigil, plus a small jar of oil. Sailor returned against the weather on the intercession of the Mother of God and his aunt's determination. Skeptics existed and were employed mainly in counting, but even skeptics snuffed their candle with care. The Empire argued about images with long, careful sentences that made carpenters late to lunch. When iconoclastic crews arrived, painters learned to paint vines that looked suspiciously articulate. Saints left the walls and hid in cupboards. Angels moved to margins. When the decrees departed, everything returned to its places with that embarrassed joy of furniture brought back to the parlor. Meanwhile, the ordinary demons kept busy. Mothers hung blue beads against the eye that never sleeps. People avoided praising a good harvest too loudly in case Providence heard and reconsidered. Priests reminded everyone that sighing behaves like spilled oil. You cannot gather it with your hands alone. Confessors listened like librarians. They recommended psalms with page numbers. Fasting calendars marched beside tax calendars, and sometimes a man was poor and devout on the same day and could not say which one he was more of. At night, when the lamplighter touched flame to wick, the bronze hanging lamps brightened like tame moons. A deacon smoothed a cloth on the altar the way a mother smooths a sheet. Someone in a doorway counted coins for bread and put 2 aside for a candle because light is also bread. The city settled its shoulders. On the wall, a guard tapped the hours with a staff, and the sound walked down the stones like a punctuation mark. In kitchens, pots agreed to simmer. Cats took their commas. The Bosporus inhaled and exhaled like a patient that had finally found a comfortable position. You might think you would not last here because of the punishments or the queue for grain or the debates that swap Greek for Latin when they get excited, but it is the calm that would undo you, the rhythm. Ovens at dawn, edicts at noon, vespers at dusk, a race if the weather and the emperor cooperate, a blessing if they do not. It is a city built on repetition that somehow never repeats, which is a very sleepable fact. And if by now your eyes are heavy, the watch will keep them for you. The lamps will finish their sentences. The bread will rise without comment. And Constantinople will glide through the dark, glittering a little, murmuring a little, as if even the stones had learned how to hum themselves back to morning. You might not expect a city draped in gold to sound like a bakery at dawn, but Constantinople begins with the soft argument of bread, the hush of pigeons, negotiating roof rights, and the distant careful clink of a gate that thinks highly of itself. The Golden Gate wakes up like a very old cat stretching its marble, not in a hurry, wholly certain that history will wait. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about soup inspectors, you may subscribe, or simply let your eyelids file for early retirement. I will not take attendance. From the hill, the city pretends to be made entirely of silk and law. From the gutter, it admits there are rats with local reputations and drains with personalities. A ceremonial procession glides past a cart of turnips, and no one finds the overlap unusual. Domes collect sunlight with the confidence of professional mirrors. The harbor exhales yesterday and inhales today. The streets, which are reluctant ropes, pull people toward errands that are both grand and ordinary. At the gate itself, the guard scratches his name into the morning with the butt of a spear. He watches caravans arrive one deliberate hoof at a time, notes who bows, who bargains, who blinks at the mosaics and decides they are made of melted stars. He has the serene certainty of a man who knows 1,000 emperors will pass, and he will still be counting sacks of grain. Walk 20 steps, and the gold politely looks away while reality speaks up. A senator lifts his robe just enough to avoid a puddle that contains an entire novella. A bootmaker shakes a lass from his sleeve and salutes nobody in particular. Water sellers call out the temperature of their amphoras as if they had negotiated it with the sun. A scribe sits cross-legged, writing receipts that look like thin planets, and a child attempts to sell you a fig by listing its virtues in order of stickiness. The city is a necklace of churches with alleyways for string. Perfume from the palace gardens mingles with a radical proposal from the fish market. A pilgrim kisses a column because someone trustworthy once said it sweats on Tuesdays. Wealth moves through these lanes with a soft gravity, as if coins preferred certain hands. You can tell who is powerful by who walks in shade, who in sun, and who makes shade move. In a courtyard, a lady in a dress the color of whispered wine tastes the snow brought from the mountains in an imperial jar. It is July, it is unnecessary, and that is the point. In the same hour, a line forms at a bakery for loaves stamped with the city's seal, which is a kind of edible law. One man weighs his bread in his palm and frowns, because in Constantinople even crumbs have lawyers. Luxury and hunger travel together like mismatched mules that nevertheless pull. The idea of cleanliness here is vigorous and collective, like a vote with steam. You enter the baths by stepping over a threshold polished by the ankles of centuries. Inside, the heat speaks a courteous dialect of cloud. Oil boys carry little flasks with the solemnity of junior priests and will, for a small fee, anoint the parts of you that persist despite persuasion. Your neighbor whispers a stock tip about pepper. A charioteer demonstrates stretching in a style that could be mistaken for prayer by the optimistic. The marble slabs are warm with remembered conversations. A strigil-curved bronze pretending to be a gentle moon scrapes away yesterday. Sweat, dust, tiny grievances, some politics. The mixture sits in a bowl looking important. A physician will later examine it the way a bishop examines doctrine. The baths are a community made of fog and rumor. Here is the man who insists garlic clears the humors if chewed with conviction. Here is his friend who believes humors are mostly weather. Germs, which lack theology but love crowds, travel by steam with diplomatic visas. In the warm room, blues and greens negotiate insults with the precision of jewelers. In the cold plunge, everyone briefly becomes a philosopher, the water knits truth. You emerge at once cleaner and more acquainted with other people's business. Food in this city is democratic in shape and aristocratic in paperwork. Bread, wine, olives, beans, a little fish if the wind remembered to help. Loaves are stamped with emblems that are both decoration and surveillance. Inspectors carry bronze weights the size of persuasive walnuts and can close a bakery by sighing. Wine is diluted at a ratio that suggests civilization is the courage to say when. The poor eat the calendar, fast days that prefer vegetables, feast days that allow butter to make speeches. A mother blows on porridge with the seriousness of a treaty. On good weeks, the harbor is a table and the city eats with both hands. On bad weeks, clouds sulk over the Black Sea, graying barges look at their shoes, and prices grow legs. People survive by trading stories for soup. The soup, officially, is lentils. Unofficially, it is information. A monk stops a boy, lifts his loaf, checks the stamp, blesses the yeast or the state. It is hard to tell. When famine threatens, the prefect posts edicts that sound like prayers with numbers. Citizens read them out loud so the words won't drift away. A baker measures carefully while his wife recites psalms over the scale. Faith and flour share a bowl again. The market returns to itself after a storm as if nothing had happened, which is how resilience introduces itself in this part of the world. Law arrives in sentences that wear sandals and mean it. The empire prefers penalties that continue the conversation. A thief might gain a letter burned into his arm and become literature. A conspirator may lose his eyes and gain a profession advising those who still possess them. Castration is a harsh door that opens into excellent administrative careers. Eunuchs run the palace like chess with hallways. They remember everything and forget nothing. They guide ceremonies that run on the clockwork of breath, incense rising through the script, processions turning on hinges of pause. A judge quotes a statute older than the city, while a scribe sands the ink the way a baker dusts flour. Mercy is also a law, but it writes in the margins. On ordinary days, justice is quietly domestic, a boundary stone moved back where it belonged. A wife's dowry restored, a mule reassigned, but the hippodrome holds a different classroom. 4 teams once existed. 2 now matter the way weather matters to ships. The blues and the greens carry their colors like verbs. Chariots crouch at the line like patient animals who understand applause. Drivers twist the reins around their waists because courage likes a belt. 1,000 tiny bets hide inside pockets. Fingers speak a currency of taps. The spina down the center watches, stacked with statues stolen from every century that stayed still too long. The race begins as a thunder that remembers it was a whisper. Most days it ends with laurel and dust and a promise to argue again tomorrow. But sometimes the cheer changes shape. Nika, they cry, conquer, and the word grows legs and walks through neighborhoods where words shouldn't be allowed to walk alone. Everything that was politics in parchment becomes politics in flame. Shops close with the embarrassed speed of people who plan to stay open. The palace negotiates with itself. A certain basilica becomes a cautionary tale. The emperor chooses whether to flee, and his wife chooses whether he chooses, and the city remembers that loyalty has a texture and it is not always smooth. Then, as abruptly as a door shutting in rain, the mood folds up. Streets are swept. New laws are read aloud in voices that deserve tea. The hippodrome pretends it was always a racetrack. Mothers count children and find the right numbers. Color returns to clothes instead of threats. The city keeps its stories folded in chests like spare linens, ready for the next time someone needs to be reminded that crowds can do trigonometry. Meanwhile, faith threads through the day like a quiet harp in a room that refuses to be entirely secular. Lamps are trimmed with the care given to infants in evidence. Icons look out from corners the way windows look out from walls. A pilgrim ties a strip of cloth to a railing beside a relic, as if fastening hope to furniture. The register of miracles reads like a shipping ledger. 1 fever unloaded, 1 ship spared a reef. 1 debt forgiven after a dream involving a monk and some persuasive bread. Skeptics exist. They keep track of candles and refuse to be impressed by the number of eyelashes in a reliquary. Still, when thunder rehearses above the straits, even skeptics make the sign that means, I understand statistics, but indulge me. Relics tour the neighborhoods under velvet umbrellas. Saints are good at public relations. The city argues, as cities do, about images. For a stretch of years, the empire doubts whether paint is a polite way to mention God. Officials order murals to rest and icons to take a vacation. Artists sigh and paint vines, which are technically not vases but look suspiciously articulate. Households tuck their favorite panel behind a cupboard where it learns the scent of cumin. When the policy reverses, angels resume their posts. Saints climb back onto walls like people returning to their usual trains. And the city pretends relief is a theological position. If you walk the lanes at night, you can hear the soft creak of certainty shifting its weight. Housewives lay scraps of bread near thresholds to distract whatever unseen thing keeps count in the dark. Sailors spit gently toward the ill-tempered wind. Shopkeepers chalk little crosses under plates because customers are unpredictable, and so is everything else. Priests teach that sign spreads like oil. Do not carry it with your hands. Confessors prescribe psalms and doses that sound like recipes. A widow keeps the names of the departed in a jar with bay leaves and whispers through them on anniversaries. Fear is here, yes, but it is domesticated, like a cat that sits on the lintel and judges the weather. Eternal judgment gets discussed between laundry and pickles. The afterlife is never far, but it is also never in the way. You end the day at the edge of the sea that looks like polished slate. The Bosporus considers Europe and Asia and decides to be a shrug for one more evening. Lanterns appear one by one, small coins spent on the dark. Somewhere a scribe finishes a sentence so carefully it feels like mending a sail. Somewhere else, a woman counts the days, change, and puts aside a copper for a candle because light is a kind of bread. In a quiet court, a eunuch closes a door with a kind of dignity that makes doors aspire. The baker's kettle sighs, remembering the dough already sleeping in bowls that look like moons. The guard walks the wall and taps his staff at the hour, marks the way. A metronome reminds a symphony it will end eventually. If you are still here, you may notice that the famous marble has the humility of stone after sunset. It does not argue. The gold, having done its work, rests. Constantinople exudes a warm tiredness like a bathhouse after the last strigil has been rinsed and hung. The city hums a civic lullaby in a key only cats and insomniacs can hear. Bread will be weighed in the morning. Edicts will be read. The hippodrome will test how loudly people can care about directions. Saints will remain attentive like good librarians. And the sea will keep the secret of how everything floats, even worlds made of ceremony, steam, and stamped crust. Let your thoughts become soft and repetitive like the waves on the seawall, and if they return with news about weights or relics or chariot bets, smile at them the way the city smiles at itself, and let them pass and let the lamps finish thinking in the quiet air until the horizon finally folds into sleep. You might not expect a city famous for gold to begin its day by sounding like 1,000 small brooms, but Constantinople wakes just so, with sweepers ticking grit toward drains that learned patience from rivers. The Golden Gate pretends it was, polished by sunlight alone. Everyone knows there were hands in rags and a man named Andreas who swore at pigeons in 3 languages. If you're still awake by the time I get to the bathhouse ladle that doubled as a medical instrument, you can subscribe, or you can simply let your eyes do what eyes have always done in a warm room. The approach to the city feels rehearsed. Hills rise like polite eyebrows. Domes sit on their drums as if they were perfectly balanced bowls of cream. Marble lions, whose diets are entirely ceremonial, guard a road that remembers more footsteps than most nations. Officials pass with sandals that don't dare squeak. From a distance, the walls are geometry, clean and abstract. Up close they have Chit marks the shape of arguments. Trumpets make the air stand at attention while pack mules disagree softly with their harnesses. It is a grand entrance in which every pebble believes it has a speaking role. The gate swallows you and reality taps your shoulder. Magnificence swerves into maintenance. A porter hops over a puddle that is either a theological puzzle or yesterday's. Fish water, it depends which way the wind is thinking. The streets are thesis and footnote at once. Here, a mosaic shouts glory from a church tympanum. There, a boy with a broom negotiates with persistent feathers. Somebody is frying tiny fish with the confidence of a general. Somebody else is negotiating the price of a cabbage wrapped in claims. A scribe sits with his wax tablets and writes receipts that look like they're trying to become birds. You learn the city by listening to the verbs grind, stamp, bless, bargain, rinse. The palace quarter makes fabric behave like entitlement. Purple tells you where to look. Sandals with pearls explain that walking can be a ceremony. Behind a perfumed screen, a courtier eats snow in July, imported from a mountain that made a living out of pretending to be cold for the right people. Farther down the hill, an old woman buys yesterday's bread because time is a condiment. The bread, by the way, wears the imperial seal on its crust, which is the legal equivalent of a nod. Inspectors carry bronze weights the size of determined apricots and can make a baker's afternoon worse by raising an eyebrow. Wealth has a route through these quarters like a canal that doesn't advertise itself. Need has a network of shortcuts. Children invent games with plum pets. Rats have names, some affectionate, some policy-based. A senator's letter passes and briefly smells like the inside of a cedar chest. The alley to the left smells like honest work. Luxuries here are practical. A shady yard in August, a jar that doesn't leak, sandals that last until the second. Child. The city performs itself in gold, but lives itself in breadcrumbs, lamp oil, and cleverness. Cleanliness in Constantinople is communal theater performed in steam. You step into the baths through a doorway polished by the persevering ankles. Of history. A young attendant pours olive oil, the shade of well-behaved thunder, into your palm and calls it health with a sales pitch that has survived 3 emperors. Someone explains that hot room, warm room, cold room is not a sequence but a philosophy. Another insists on the proper angle for a strigil, which is the curved bronze cousin of a crescent moon, and scrapes away everything yesterday left behind, including opinions. Soap, a shared luxury, is a blend of ashes and fat with the personality of a polite cloud. It travels from hand to hand, and so does whatever is living in the soap. Germs, which never paid a tax, commute by steam and towel. Men argue about horse teams and voices softened by humidity. Women discuss dowries like accountants whose ledgers happen to be scented. In the barber's corner, you can have your hair, your nails, or an inconvenient opinion trimmed. Bloodletting is available with a reassuringly clean bowl that has seen things. The water pipes sing a hollow song up in the walls. Aqueducts do their marching as reliably as a hymn with good legs. The baths clean you, yes. They also make introductions, start gossip, and spread whatever needs spreading with the efficiency of warm tile. Food is the second religion. Bread comes first in the prayer and in the hand. The grain ships from across the sea arrive on time. When the weather is in a cooperative mood and forget themselves entirely when it isn't, loaves are stamped with patterns that look like little treaties. Each stamp says, I agree to be flour, salt, and law. Wine is diluted to ratios that imply civilization is essentially mathematics done in cups. Lentils are a recurring theme. So are onions, garlic, and the occasional salted fish that knows it is an exclamation point. On feast days, butter makes a speech, and everyone applauds with spoons. On fast days, olive oil is elevated from ingredient to philosophy. The poor eat. The calendar. The rich eat around it. Somewhere a monk is counting bites because holiness loves numbers. At dawn, the prefect's notice board lists screen prices in letters that don't blink. In the market, a woman lifts a loaf to weigh it by sorrow. An experience. She sniffs, listens for the dull thud of dishonest air, and exchanges a look with the baker's wife that has been perfected over centuries of rationing. When famine threatens, the city chooses seriousness. Dock officials count sacks so energetically. They begin to dream in tallies. Edicts promise loaves, then smaller loaves, then loaves if the wind shifts its character. A dried fig becomes a holiday. Soup changes from food to an event. People survive by watering stories until they stretch to morning. It is not glamorous, but it is extraordinarily well organized, the way a beehive is organized by the absence of leisure. Justice in this empire likes to leave proof it visited. The law is copious and footnoted and believes in cause and effect, preferably engraved. A thief might become acquainted with a branded letter and live with grammar ever after. A traitor may greet the world without the opinion of his eyes and discover the administrative arts where vision is optional and memory is compulsory. Castration is used not as spectacle but as policy, which is bland and therefore terrifying. Eunuchs administer things so deftly that even keys behave. They glide through corridors with the authority of people who remember your grandmother's maiden name. Judges speak out of books that smell faintly of dust, leather, and the relief of precedent. They quote Justinian with the energy of a favorite uncle, and clerks drank with sand as if finishing cookies. O's cling to relics because wood and bone hold secrets better than people do. Penalties are designed to prevent the next problem and to leave the present one so tidy you could eat. Off it, though nobody recommends that. If you want noise, you go to the Hippodrome, which is both racetrack and city-sized opinion. The blues and the greens hold meetings with flags. Boys on the way, they rehearse insults as if they were psalms. Vendors sell chickpea cakes, dates, and the sort of wine that believes in itself too much. The spina down the center of the track is a museum that forgot its doors. Statues from all over the empire climb on to watch as if bored with their previous jobs. Charioteers tie reins around their waists because bravery likes knots. Everything vibrates, dust, banners, throats. The first lap tastes like hope and grit. Bets are kept on knotted cords and sleeves and on the undersides of tongues. On good days, the crowd roars, the winners lean dramatically, and everyone goes home to retell the race with improvements. On unpredictable days, cheering remembers other words. Nika, someone tries, meaning conquer, and the syllables multiply as fast as rumor. People who were wearing colors realize colors are wearing them. Politics takes off its robe and puts on speed. The emperor's household does arithmetic. With risks, a church becomes a refuge, then a tomb, then a lesson. Afterwards, edicts are read slower than usual, and street sweepers move their brooms like apologies. The Hippodrome becomes a racetrack again because cities are very good at acting normal after they have experimented with being otherwise. Faith here is not a season but the climate. The day bends around bells. In the morning, streets smell faintly of beeswax and last night's stew. In the afternoon, incense lays a ribbon over market noise and ties it with a bow. At night, lamps cough into the dark and decide to keep working. A neighbor writes the names of her dead on slips of paper and tucks them into a psalter like gentle thieves. A dock worker wears a small metal cross as insurance against storms, employers, and statistics. Miracles are kept like accounts. This spring healed a knee once in the reign of someone with too many vowels. That icon sweated politely on the third Thursday of a very hot year. Skeptics stand nearby, counting candles and observing humidity, speaking softly so as not to upset those who prefer wonder to arithmetic. A priest with the breadth of a wardrobe in his voice intones mysteries, while two children measure the length of the sermon in hell. Many times they can braid and unbraid a cord. Madness and holiness sometimes share a bench. One man sees angels. In the laundry steam, another insists that mice are stealing letters from his prayers. Families bring both to church with similar patience. Healers prescribe poultices, psalms, and occasionally a stern nap. Demons are blamed for many things, including the inclination to talk during readings and the sudden desire for lentils on a fast day that forbids lentils. Relics travel through neighborhoods in careful boxes. People clasp them with the respect you give to a bone that has outlived several empires and knows things. A feather, definitely from an archangel if you ask the man with the box, glints like surrendered sunlight. During iconoclasm, the city learns how to hide faces. Paintings retire behind cupboards with jars of cumin. Saints go on sabbatical too. Attics, where they acquire the dust of domesticity and the new intimacy with spiders. Some citizens become experts in ivy and geometric borders, which are allowed to be painted without scandal, and produce vines so eloquent that eyes feel seen. Anyway, when images are welcomed back, walls brighten as if someone opened a theology. People cry as if aesthetics were plumbing. The arguments do not end. They simply change prepositions. Fear of judgment remains a neighborhood virtue. It keeps shopkeepers honest and children within arm's reach. It is heavy, but shared loads are mysteriously lighter. If you remain awake, the city's bedtime routine is gentle and oddly bureaucratic. A clerk ties tomorrow's decree with string that knows its job. A baker polishes his paddle, which is the size of a sensible door, and tucks a lump of fermenting dough to sleep like a small, quarrelsome pet. Cats patrol roof lines like fuzzy magistrates. Fish scales glitter in the gutter like coins promising to be better coins in the morning. A watchman taps the hour with a staff that is mostly a metronome. Somewhere, a eunuch closes a chest with the dignity of a novel putting itself away. Somewhere else, a woman checks the seal on her oil jar twice, because trust is good, wax is better. The sea yawns against the seawall. The Bosporus lies down between continents and pretends to be a long, patient dog. If you listen carefully, you can hear the city rehearse tomorrow under its breath. Bread, wine, weights, words, water, law, color, prayer. You would not last a day here, not because the place is cruel, though it can be, but because each hour is crowded with more certainty and improvisation than a modern afternoon knows where to store. The glamour and the grime get along with the comfort of old neighbors. Even fear is domesticated, sleeping at the foot of the bed like a faithful, slightly judgmental cat. Let your mind match the brooms, the bells, the soft talk. Between marble and mildew, let the domes exhale. Let the lamps consider their wicks. And if a rat with a famous name scampers through your thoughts, it is only the city's way of tucking you in, assuring you that tomorrow the gates will gleam again, and the streets will argue again, and the bread will be stamped with law, and somewhere a child will try to sell you a fig by listing its virtues in alphabetical order until you sleep. You might not expect a city of gold to begin with the smell of warm bread and tired river mud, but Constantinople always liked to introduce itself in layers, like a pastry that keeps adding flickers of butter until you forget the flour, the morning. Air wears bells, the gulls read the tide like a timetable. The Golden Gate is awake before everyone else, stretching its arches as if marble could yawn. It shines in that particular bureaucratic way, less sparkle, more statement, as though it has completed all required forms to be impressive. Guards stand with faces that learn stillness from columns. Merchants who never filed any forms perfectly practice their prices out loud. And just beyond the first loveliness, the street begins to tell a different truth. the kind you hear in a soft scuff of sandals and a persuasive hum of flies. A fountain asks politely to be a mirror, but the bucket wins. You step forward and the city steps back, letting you notice how the grand avenue sutures to a web of alleys where chickens discuss politics and a cat, the color of unanswered questions, chooses a doorstep like a throne. The Golden Gate loves the sun, but the gutters love the shade. Someone has already washed last night's arguments into the drains with a bucket that used to be a wine jar. Marble cornices pretend the world is geometry. Below them, a fishmonger arranges sardines into an arrow that points to lunch. You pass. A plaque that says an emperor once sneezed here, in effect, and another plaque that would say the same if anyone had commissioned it. The road is paved with a philosophy of stones that care about order until the next cartwheel teaches them humility. One man sells dried figs by telling each one's biography. Another, a water seller with a voice like a declarative sentence, advertises the temperature of his amphora as if he had invented coolness. And then there's a rat. Byzantine rats are respectful, broadly literate in the smell of spices, and rather athletic. They do not fear you, but they will not trouble you either, unless you trouble their crumbs, which they consider entirely theirs by right of early discovery. The palaces sit like thoughts the city decided to keep. Silk sighs up the doorways. Eunuchs move through corridors with the authority of people who always have the correct key, even when the locks are new. A boy with pearl-sewn slippers tries walking without creasing the future. In another quarter, a woman counts copper coins twice, and then, for luck, a third time. Roman law is very clear on weights and measures. It is less clear on hunger's opinions. The baker's stamp presses an eagle into the dough with a gesture that has known a million warnings. Inspectors carry bronze weights shaped like quietly stubborn birds. They make rounds with the ceremonial gravity of minor planets. When the emperor rides by, the crowd has a choreography it learned in infancy. Cheer, glance at the sky for omens. Consider lunch. Luxury here is never alone. It always finds itself next to something practical, a perfumed robe airing beside a courtyard, where a child is inventing a game with a walnut and 3 stones. You can stand in a doorway and watch 2 centuries pass on the same paving slab, a senatorial sandal in memory, and a market shoe in the present, sharing dust for a moment before parting ways. If you're still awake when we reach the bathhouse, you can subscribe, although it is a decidedly modern verb for a city that preferred words with marble in them, or forget to and let the steam fog the rest of this sentence. Baths are Constantinople's daily theater, humid and democratic. You enter through a vestibule busy with sandals, where leather straps relax like tired snakes. The hot room accepts. You with an embrace that has opinions. An attendant with a practiced wrist pours olive oil into your palm as if serving philosophy by the spoonful. The stone bench warms your bones with slow confidence. Astrigil the curved scraper every citizen secretly rates more highly than several. Civil servants removes the day from your skin and ribbons you are not asked to examine too closely. Men talk about horse teams and wheat prices, then about theology with the same intonation they use to discuss onions. Women negotiate dowries and recipes and how best to keep moths from silk, which is a question historians rarely footnote for reasons of professional jealousy. The bath is clean, which means that every damp tile has shaken hands with 1,000 neighbors today. Soap travels from person to person with the social life of a senator. Germs enjoy the amenities in silence and are not taxed. A physician of the sensible sort lurks near a pillar and prescribes, in order, rest, diluted wine, common sense, and, if pressed, a rearrangement of humors conducted by someone trustworthy and slightly bored. Your hair is trimmed by a barber who measures time in the length of beards. Somewhere in the warm room, an old man explains the correct ratio of hot to cold for every moral problem. The aqueducts sigh overhead. They are the city's long throats, and know things about pressure that poets should envy. Pipes sing faintly in the walls, a little chorus telling you that hygiene is a group project. Food, being the second religion after water, begins early. Bread is stamped, blessed by hunger, and served with the confidence of something that knows it is the answer twice a day. Wine is mixed with water in proportions that would scandalize later centuries. Here it is called moderation, and the emperor agrees. Lentils put in appearances so frequent they consider themselves family. Onions are the republic of the poor. In good months there's cheese, whose smell cannot be mistaken for theology, though some have tried. Fish arrive with salt still persuading them, and olives line up patiently the way reliable friends do. Inspectors chalk prices on boards. A mother weighs a loaf with her hands as if justice could be tuned by fingers. Famine is a discipline the city prefers not to practice, but sometimes does. Then rumor and soup become synonyms. Priests distribute loaves called consolation by people who know better but appreciate the effort. The calendar, with its alternating feast days and fasts, dictates the menu like a very polite tyrant. On fast the pots simmer with oil and legumes. On feasts they speak butter out loud. Everyone is convinced these customs preserve the soul. Incidentally, they also preserve the purse. Law in the empire is thorough, annotative, and fond of gold seals. The courts are rooms where time has been taught to sit. Judges quote Justinian in voices that suggest he just stepped out to fetch a penknife. Clerks sand the ink on parchment so carefully you expect to see them blow dust into clouds shaped like griffins. There is ceremony around oaths. Swearing on a relic is like signing a contract witnessed by eternity, which is not known for forgiving late fees. Punishments aspire to be both persuasive and permanent. A thief may make the acquaintance of a branded letter, a conjunction that follows him into the market, the bathhouse, the quiet moment before sleep. Traitors sometimes meet the world again without their former opinions. Blinding is common enough. To be unremarkable to the law and always remarkable to life. Castration is politics by other instruments. Eunuchs, having been removed from one set of possibilities, tend the rest with ferocious competence. Chests open for them. Doors behave. They glide down corridors, leaving everything behind them more orderly than it was, like mops with excellent. PENMANSHIP. Justice is precise about property, but lenient to accident. The city knows the difference between malice and misalignment. A baker's underweight loaf gets a lecture and a fine. A famine gets a prayer and a program. The street prefers harmony, the way a well-tuned lyre prefers strings that agree. Small injuries are solved by relatives. Large ones are solved by processions. If your neighbor's donkey has eaten your cabbage, there is a page in the code for that. There is also a page several for the owning and selling of silk, which the state treats as a substance halfway between cloth and diplomacy. People remember penalties more vividly than rights, but both exist, stamped into law like seals on wax. The hippodrome is where the empire checks its pulse loudly. It is a racetrack, a fairground, and a parliament that has forgotten to sit down. Boys on there weigh their practice insults they have stolen from uncles. Vendors repeat menus as if they invented bread. The banners of the blues and greens snap the air into colors. Charioteers stand as if riding were a theological stance. When the teams tilt into the curve, the crowd leans with them, as if the outcome were a matter of personal posture. Bets are recorded by knots on cords, a private mathematics worn up the sleeve. Somewhere across the spina, the long island dividing the track, an obelisk observes. Everything with a patience learned in Egypt. The racing is simple. Go fast, turn left, survive. The meaning is complicated. It is loyalty, municipal, tribal, imperial, seasonal, superstitious. Most days end in dust and stories. Some end in arithmetic done with soldiers. The city has learned to return to ordinary life after extraordinary afternoons with the same method it uses to fold tablecloth scare. Practiced hands and the decision to act as if linen were invincible. Faith and fear in Constantinople share. A long, cordial conversation that begins before dawn. Lamps burn with the mild stubbornness of people who will not concede to wind. Incense travels everywhere it can, which is almost everywhere. The poor carry wooden crosses polished by thumbs. The rich endow lamps bright enough to persuade nearby dust to behave. Miracles exist in that useful ambiguity between moisture and mercy. This icon wept during a particularly hot August. That spring healed a knee reputed to belong to a fisherman, although records do not specify which river he favored. Skeptics speak quietly because reverence has better hearing. A priest chants words older than the city, so simple you start to believe simple is the oldest thing of all. Children memorize everything accidentally and later repeat it back with additions. Usually about bread dot if grief is a tide, relics are the breakwaters. People press cloths to boxes containing saints' bones, returning later with folded confidence. A woman tucks a lock of her child's hair into a psalter and believes this to be effective because it is. A fisherman promises to give up swearing. For a week if his nuts agree to remember fish. In an upper room, a monk copies the gospel slowly enough to be mistaken for winter. His ink is brown, his letters are well-bred, and his mistakes are forgiven by the margin. During the periods when icons were deemed improper company, people developed a sudden, intense interest in ivy, stars, and geometric borders. Saints retired, temporarily behind cupboards where they learned the smells of cumin and stew. When the winds changed, paint returned to faces with a vigor that embarrassed everyone into relief. The devout and the cautious resumed their usual truce. Fear of eternal failure is popular and practical. It organizes the day. It keeps shopkeepers honest more effectively than any inspector. It convinces a man to return a borrowed jar unchipped. It persuades a child to say the truth about the broken spindle, although the child will test several sentences first, the way one tests water with a toe. Confession has the pace of a good lullaby. Steady low, gentle on consonants. Everyone makes the sign of the cross at thunder because thunder requires punctuation. A neighbor woman knows 15 prayers by heart and 2 by elbow because that is where she wrote them when she had no paper-free dot. By evening, the city has used up its voices and starts again with smaller ones. The market sweeps itself closed. Grooms learn the geometry of corners. In the kitchen courtyards, cook fires exhale like old men. A clerk blows out a lamp with the care of someone extinguishing a minor deity. Cats exchange jurisdiction. A guard walks his beat with a staff that politely informs doorways of the time. Above, domes cool with the sound of stones remembering night. The sea pats the seawall like a friend reluctant to say goodbye. Families eat the last of the stew and fold bread for tomorrow. Someone tells a story about an emperor and a jar of pickled plums, which has at least 3 morals and no ending. If your eyes are heavy, that is only because Byzantium measures time with ounces of oil and thinks night is a lamp that has finished its sentence. Let the city's pipes and prayers hum you toward quiet. Let the gates keep their watch with dignity. That is mostly habit. Let the baker's starter breathe in its bowl, a small living biography of flour. You would not last a day here, perhaps not because the place is cruel to strangers, but because its days are densely woven and require the risks of people who were born knowing how to knot things. Fortunately, it does not ask you to last. It asks you to listen to the soft counting of coins, the far-off argument of gulls, The broom that learns the floor every night and forgets it every morning so that it can learn it again. You might not expect a marble triumphal arch to have a favorite time of day, but the Golden Gate of Constantinople wakes best at first light. When the brass fittings remember they are mirrors and the city tests its voice with a few trial clatters. The gate does what impressive gates do. It stands still and conducts authority like a lightning rod for ceremony. Courtiers drift past with the careful float of clothing that knows it has precedence. A clerk fusses over a ribbon decree as if tying a shoe on history. Pigeons perform civic duties no one assigned. Then politely, the rest of the city clears its throat. The main avenue opens into alleys that do not care for marble. There the day smells like warm yeast, damp rope, and the frank ambition of fish. A hawker sells figs by telling each one's origin story. Water sellers shout the temperature of their amphorae with theatrical seriousness as though coolness were a guild. If you concentrate, you can hear the laws marching past weights and measures. Stamp blows, the price of salt, but the gutters hum back their own commentary. Rats, educated by centuries of bakeries, audit the crumbs. Dogs read the news by Saint. Somewhere above, a silken banner goes nowhere slowly and looks pleased about the arrangement. The Golden Gate promises an empire. A side street promises lunch. The balance pleases the city, which has always loved a two-part sentence. Gold and mud, incense and garlic, imperial edict and market joke. A palace eavesdrops on a courtyard where a boy throws a walnut against a wall that has outlived 18. Emperors and a few local politicians you are not required to remember. Inside the palace, porphyry columns breathe in their dignified purple way. Outside, a rope maker taps the twist of hemp with a rhythm any musician would envy. The same sun glances off both, impartial as a bookkeeper. Luxury arranges itself on terraces with a talent for height. Hunger arranges itself on thresholds with a talent for patience. An inspector from the office of the eparch checks loaf stamps with bronze weights shaped like birds, and his serious little scale judges the morning with immaculate indifference. In the tenements, a mother weighs the same loaf with her hands and decides, also with indifference, that it will do. Piety eats breakfast with appetite, so does worry. The city's charitable kitchens ladle out consolation under saints' names, and no one argues with soup when it is accurate. Meanwhile, the silks are airing. Eunuchs, efficient as the margin notes of a lawyer, glide through corridors with keys that fit not only locks but situations. At a window, a young aristocrat practices the correct angle of gaze for balcony appearances. But fractional downward kindness that says, "Yes, I know your names in the abstract." On the street below, a scribe offers to compose letters for people who have more feelings than handwriting. He can make your petition sound urgent or humble. For an extra coin, he can make it sound inevitable. It is an economy in which olive oil is both food and theology, and waxes are small, circular concentrations of faith. If you're still awake by the time we reach the bathhouse, feel very free to subscribe. Or don't. Constantinople will continue either way, and so will this whisper. The bathhouse opens like a warm vowel. Steam unspools from the door with the practiced grace of a public servant who knows everyone's name. You undress in a room that resembles a polite argument between towels and benches. An attendant with a copper basin pours water over your shoulders the way rain might behave if it had training. Olive oil gleams in a shallow dish, waiting to negotiate with skin. The floor hums with heat from ducts below, a kind of stone sighing. The city learned from Rome and never stopped perfecting. In the hot room, men discuss horse teams with earnest theology, and theology with the horse team tone that cuts through complexities like a strigil through yesterday. A physician, leaning against a pillar in the relaxed posture of a person who has already invented medicine today, prescribes moderation, then repeats himself for emphasis, then If pressed, a change in the weather. Cleanliness has crowds. Basins serve strangers as if friendship were measured in ladles. Soap travels from hand to hand with the charisma of an office roomer. Sponge is personal, yes, but aspirationally communal do work that invites rhetorical questions. The city believes in water the way some people believe in simple arithmetic. If applied steadily, it will make sense of things. It often does. And yet disease has a talent for socializing, and fleas keep a quiet calendar. The humoral map of the body, hot, cold, wet, dry, sits in the mind like a weather chart, and everyone checks it before deciding whether to drink wine or complain. Silver amulets whistle faint instructions against the chest. Garlic claims to be a shield. A grandmother pats a grandson's forehead and declares him cured by the depth of her sentiment, which is at least a pleasant medicine. Outside the baths, the day has a menu. Bread first, of course. Wheat when the gods are smiling, barley when they are occupied elsewhere. Loaves stamped with official marks are held to the light the way scribes hold parchments, searching for honesty and texture. Wine arrives agreeably diluted, because sobriety and plumbing are state priorities. Cheese identifies itself by smell at a distance you can plan around. Lentils commute tirelessly between pot and bowl. Fish attends when the winds favor fishermen, who swear they can read the Bosporus like handwriting. The market is a catalog of small confidences, sesame that promises crunch, olives that have perfected gloom, dried figs that convince you they once contained more sun than any window. Fasting days fold themselves through the calendar like quiet parentheses. On those days, oil stands in for butter, and the city congratulates itself on discipline while sniffing pastry shops in passing. Famine is a word the streets have learned to say softly. When the harvest fails, the rumor mill grinds flour finer than any millstone. Prices sprout wings. Grain ships are counted the way children are counted in storms, repeatedly and with unreasonable hope. There are public measures and private stashes, relief processions and practical onions. And when the first full carts return, the city forgives everything, including itself. The law keeps its papers in order. The code bound, annotated, multiplied by very careful handwriting rests, like a square of granite on every argument, and the courts unpack it with ceremony. Judges wear patience the way others wear cloaks. Clerks sand the wet ink on verdicts as if they were polishing opinions. Oaths happen in front of relics because eternity is extremely good at witness protection. For the guilty, there are punishments that prefer certainty to imagination. Branding is public memory written on skin. A letter becomes a lifelong companion, a mark that says, "I once quarreled with property law and lost." Blinding the empires. Tidy way of removing someone from the short list of emperors is administered with a seriousness that makes doctors respectful and poets vague. Castration, too, is used as a constitutional amendment for individuals, with unintended side effects. Men thus amended become excellent administrators, proof that politics sometimes appoints competence by strange routes. If all this feels a little stern, the city would shrug and point to the alternative, which is chaos, and then present a broom as its rebuttal. Justice in practice works like a ledger with marginal notes and garlic. The baker short waits. He pays. The donkey eats the neighbor's cabbages. There's a page for that. A merchant dilutes wine beyond the accepted scholarship. He meets the eparch's eyebrows. Meanwhile, bribes move through town as patiently as water seeks lower ground. Everyone knows the going rate for a favor. Everyone pretends not to. A small coin greases a hinge. A large coin redesigns the door. There is scandal, naturally, but also the long, slow consolation of forms filled correctly in stamps that align. It is a city that loves the sound a seal makes when it meets wax, the small kiss of bureaucracy and destiny, Then the Hippodrome, which is not so much a place as a weekly idea. It is where the crowd outsings itself, where the blues and greens turn identity into vocabulary, where charioteers ride like punctuation dashes and exclamation points on wheels. You approach through corridors lined with vendors who shout menus, with the certainty of profits, bread, dried fruit, prayers for the favorite team. In the imperial box, the emperor becomes a spectator for a few hours, which is as close as an emperor gets to rest. The track curls like a huge sentence, and the teams write and rewrite it with 8 laps of dust. The obelisk in the center, imported from a previous millennium with no intention of learning the language, watches without moving. Betting cords knot around wrists. Boys practice cheers the way monks practice psalms. Sometimes, like weather, a mood builds. The tension wafts like pepper. A chant develops opinions. History is capable of choosing drama here, but most days it chooses exercise and arguments, then everyone goes home. If you're blinking slowly by now, you're doing as the city does after races. It breathes out, reconsiders lunch, and rearranges. Allegiance to the grocery list. Faith is the city's second language and its morning coffee. Bells crawl through the air with a domestic persistence. Incense advances along naves in soft clouds that look like punctuation marks the priests have thrown into the sermon for emphasis. A weeping icon earns a cue. A dry one earns a cleaning. Either way, candles are sold. Pilgrims buy tokens the size of coins, stamped with holy architecture, which they keep in boxes where later grandchildren will find them and ask sensible questions. The city believes in miracles as it believes in aqueducts. Not everywhere, not always, but often enough. To justify maintenance, a blind man squints and sees a little more than he did yesterday. A mother's fever goes down while a saint's bone is paraded past. A sailor attributes favorable winds to an expensive candle and vows to buy 2 next time as a bulk discount on salvation. Skeptics exist and are loved by the city in the same way it loves cats that do not belong to anyone. And there is madness, or what the century names madness, moving at the edge of things like wind. A woman speaks to a saint the way one speaks to a neighbor who can fix things. A monk decides silence is the loudest music and keeps at it until he can tell time by dust. Possessions and exorcisms take place with the seriousness of laundry. Physicians prescribe bloodletting with professional gravity. Priests prescribe psalms with the same face. Both suggest sleep. There are amulets stitched into hems, scraps of scripture worn against the heart, the well-known charm against envy. Cut in tin and hanging in windows where it oxidizes with piety, dreams are taken personally. You can sleep in a church incubation, they call it, and accept whatever message comes at 3 a.m. like a delivery. Often the message is, be kinder or eat fewer onions, or stop worrying about the weather. All of these are within reach, but fear lives close by. Icons are precious, then perilous, then precious again, depending on the reigning winds of opinion. In one decade, faces are kissed, in another they are covered, in a third they return with new halos and improved varnish. People adapt with the supple piety of laundry lines. Whatever the season, there will be shirts. A craftsman who once painted saints now carves vines with a flourish learned from angel wings. Nothing is wasted. Meanwhile, the apocalypse has a polite schedule. Comets are noted. Earthquakes produce lists. Solar eclipses urge fasting and a certain amount of standing very still. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has a relative who knows someone who saw a sign. Eternal fear is practical. It keeps shopkeepers honest, convinces children to return borrowed cups, persuades husbands to come home on time. The threat of hellfire is, among other things, an excellent traffic policy. Night returns like a clerk to its desk. Lamps sputter and then decide to glow. The baker's starter breathes in its bowl, a small domestic beast that must be fed. A family eats a stew of things that learn to cooperate while simmering. Someone tells an anecdote about an emperor who sneezed at the wrong moment and thereby changed the fate of a ceremonial goose. As stories go, it fixes nothing and amends everything. On a rooftop, a woman counts stars until she reaches a number that feels round. In the great cisterns, water waits with a patience that is almost affectionate. The sea taps the sea while the way a friend taps a door jamb on the way out. A cat patrols a line of sleeping sandals with professional satisfaction. Somewhere a bell rings the city into an hour it has visited 10,000 times. You might not last a day here. Not because the city is cruel, though it can be, and not because the rules are many, though they are, but because Constantinople is dense in a way that modern hours have forgotten, layered like its own pastries, every layer buttered with detail that insists on being noticed before you can move to the next. Yet the city does not demand endurance from you at midnight. It offers something easier, the sound of distant water, the practiced hush of domes cooling, and the low, civic purr of a place that knows it will still be here in the morning, folding bread into baskets, testing the weight of justice on its scales, lighting lamps that promise nothing and deliver precisely that, a measured circle of light in which to rest your eyes and, if you like, sleep. You might not expect a ceremonial arch to have a daily routine, but the Golden Gate keeps office hours. At dawn, it wakes with its stones, feels the day warm through the marble like tea creeping through porcelain, and tries on its various moods. Triumphant for processions, dignified for regular traffic, tolerant for everything in between. The gilded fittings flirt with the first light. A sleepy guard, already overshined with polish, taps the haft of his spear against a groove that centuries of tapping have confessed. The avenue beyond yawns itself awake with the sound of sandals and pigeons negotiating rent. Incense from an early liturgy drifts through the gate's arches and meets the neighbor smells of bread, fish, and optimism. On the far side of the same stones, an alley considers itself exempt from grandeur. It has puddles that remember last, nights reign and ambitions that extend to lunch. The city greets the morning in two registers at once, as if it were a choir rehearsing different pieces and politely not correcting itself. In the palaces, breakfast includes silver and opinions. In the courtyards, breakfast includes onions and practical plans. A notary passes under the gate carrying a neat roll of parchment like a harmless weapon. He wears the look of a man who knows where the commas go. Near him, a woman selling figs has arranged her fruit in the ancient pattern of pleasing and reachable, which is not a geometry taught in schools but ought to be. A small boy pulls a cart that used to be a door. A monk with eyebrows like parentheses accepts a cup of water without theological comment. The street is a slow parade of exact purposes: mule, basket, broom, saint's icon, a sequence of errands, the dignity of getting them done. If you are still awake by the time we get to the bathhouses, you can subscribe, or you can decide that subscribing is a modern equivalent of lighting a candle and perform it in your heart. There will be no quiz. The city will continue to hum whether observed or not. It has trained for this. Under the morning's polish, the corners show their honest faces. Constantinople pretends to be made entirely of marble, but its favorite material is improvisation. A palace window stares down at a roof patched with amphora shards and good intentions. Purple silk glows on a balcony like restrained thunder. Across the alley, a laundry line improvises a flag of shirts. A steward rehearses the day's reprimands, weighing each against the specific gravity of favor. An inspector from the office of the eparch measures loaves with bronze weights shaped like very serious pigeons. The bakers, as always, swear their dough rose on principle. A few streets away, a fishmonger resets his display to suggest abundance. Even when the wind has teased the boats, he argues with a cat in complete sentences and loses gracefully. The back lanes have opinions about sewage, and the front avenues have opinions about ceremony, and both are correct. Luxury rarely resists the urge to pose. It drapes itself. It cultivates surfaces that know how to catch a reflection from the corner of the eye, the way a lake knows how to keep a cloud. At the same time, hunger keeps remarkably good books. The poor take inventory of the afternoon in terms of bread, and spices are regarded as charming rumors. A boy learns to carve a spoon from a scrap of olive wood, and the spoon learns to be a legacy. A widow speaks to a loaf the way a banker speaks to interest, respectfully and with an ear for increase. On festival days, generosity conducts street traffic like a cheerful magistrate, showing coins into the open hands of strangers. On ordinary days, people manage. The city supports both days with the same patient infrastructure of habit, the baths. Of course, if the gate has office hours, the bathhouse has a personality. It greets you like a recipe: warm water, cool marble, a measured pinch of gossip. Steam stains the air with a faint sweetness. You undress while doing arithmetic with hooks and towel edges, then surrender to a warm room where the ceiling breathes. An attendant pours water from a copper ewer in a way that suggests he is finishing a sentence you did not know you had begun. A strigil scrapes yesterday from your skin with the kindly efficiency of a clerk pruning a ledger. Oils shine in shallow dishes like reasonable promises. People talk about horses, taxes, saints, weather, and the proper distance to maintain between. A cup of wine and a second cup of wine there is the theory of health, which prefers balance, and the practice of health, which prefers luck. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, still hold editorial positions in the body's newspaper. A patient crossed with melancholy might be prescribed lighter music and heavier soup. Another is instructed to imagine blue and drink water at the pace of a thoughtful squirrel. Physicians with beards combed to the official angle recommend restraint. Then, if pressed, restraint all over again. The city tries. It had plagues before, and it will have them again. So it cultivates clean hands and clean consciences, not always in that order. The bathhouse can spread health, or help mix it evenly. Both things seem unfair in different ways, but fairness is not on the schedule, and the attendants already have a cue. After bathing, the body negotiates with the market. The diet is a guided tour of what ships and seasons will allow. Bread sits on the throne. The empire has a lot to say about bread. Loaves are stamped, counted, weighed, and briefly admired. Wine introduces itself at a responsible dilution and claims to be a conversation in a cup. The city nods. Lentils perform their admirable trick of being better than they look. On fasting, days in there are many. As the calendar likes discipline, the cuisine makes clever use of olive oil, vegetables, and the social contract. Fish has its own liturgy. On not fasting days, cheese speaks louder. Honey is a quiet brag. Garlic is a public policy. People eat standing at counters, sitting on steps, leaning in doorways. The poor take care of the flour. The rich take care of the spices. The city takes care of pretending this is the same thing. Sometimes the wind is wrong, or the rain is wrong, or the gods are distracted by more luminous matters, and the harvest forgets to be generous. Then famine walks the streets with the gentle stride of an auditor. Prices rehearse acrobatics. Grain ships enter the city like parables and are counted with a fervor usually reserved for relics. The government does what it can with edicts, granaries, and confidence. Families do what they can with thrift and onion soup. Neighbors stare together at millstones as if staring might produce flour by concentrated hope. Famine eventually remembers. The road out and takes it, Leaving behind a new respect for barley and a few revised recipes, the law sits in a quiet room and writes in confident ink. The great code lies on the table like a domesticated mountain. Scribes copy, judges listen. Advocates polish their declensions until they squeak. Contracts bear seals pressed into wax with tiny, important pictures. A saint, an eagle, a name that believes in itself. Oaths occur in the company of relics because it is good to have witnesses who are difficult to bribe. For mischief that steals too neatly, branding is the city's way of leaving a footnote on a person. The letter seared into the skin is not a metaphor and will accept no edits. Blinding is a constitutional procedure disguised as medical intervention, a method of disqualifying someone from the short list of future emperors with the solemnity of a ritual. Eunuchs, that particular amendment to the male body, hold keys, schedules, budgets, and in many cases the empire's sanity. It is not the career advice you asked for, but it has its admirers. Justice, being earthly, coexists companionably with influence. Bribes exist the way Lent exists, inevitable and not always worth remarking unless it clumps. A small coin may persuade a hinge. A larger one may persuade a hinge to imagine it is. A gate, the eparch governs markets, noise, prices, fire safety, and the public decency of eels. His agents measure, confiscate, scold, and occasionally are thanked. Elsewhere, the city's night watch strolls with lamps whose flames move like punctuation. They enforce the kind of order that likes to be seen in profile. The morning finds their footprints and says, yes, someone took us seriously in the dark. On race days, the hippodrome practices joy at a volume that would concern a librarian. Blues and greens wear their colors on sleeves, voices, souls. Charioteers are discussed as if they were the city's nephews. Everyone advises their career and forgives their mistakes. The track curves around an ancient stone that has seen empires behave like people, and people behave like empires. The emperor attends and is briefly a spectator, which is a sort of democracy the city enjoys in manageable doses. Vendors balance trays of sesame rings like portable halos. Debates about tactics sound suspiciously like debates about politics, or vice versa. A boy, seeing the horses, decides to be a wheel. Now and then the excitement overreaches, and the crowd proves it is also a weather system. But most days after the 8th lap, the cheers decant into laughter and roast chickpeas, and the city walks home together in a pleasantly disordered argument about who was robbed by fate and who was rescued by it. Faith is the other. Architecture. Domes take the weight of worry the way a good blanket takes the weight of sleep. Bells announce time with such confidence that the hour agrees on politeness. Incense travels in organized clouds, issuing visas for thoughts to cross the border into reverence. Icons regard you from wood with the calm competence of faces that have practiced not blinking for centuries. People light candles as if light were a coin you can spend on hope. A saint's fragment, a tooth, a finger bone, a sliver of habit circulates through the nave as gently as a rumor. Some nights, someone sleeps in a church on purpose to attract a healing dream, and in the morning, the dream always recommends the same medicine, patience, and perhaps fewer onions. Miracles do occur, and so do diagnoses. A woman hears a hymn and finds her chest lighter by the duration of the chorus. A boy who stutters speaks clearly to a saint, and then continues the conversation with his mother, who does not comment except with her hands. A monk climbs a pillar and lives on top of it to negotiate with heaven in a place with good reception. Physicians smile and prescribe better shoes. Priests smile and prescribe better prayers. Nobody is offended. Madness, when it arrives, is treated with dimensions. A little bloodletting to shorten the world. A little psalmody to lengthen it again. an amulet sewn into a hem to convince the fear that it has already been addressed in writing. The city has lived through arguments about pictures, those anxious, complicated decades when faces became forbidden and then welcome again, like relatives with strong opinions reminded to use indoor voices. During those years, mothers hid their painted saints in bread boxes, and carvers learned to carve patterns that were almost faces and then not. When the icon returned, it came back with better frames, as if the absence had taught people about emphasis. A few households kept both moods on the wall, a cross with nothing on it next to a face with everything on it, an exhibit of theology and the decorative arts. Piety is adaptable. It loves a corner as much as a cathedral. Fear of the end of the world is not a hobby so much as a companion plant. Comets arrive like punctuation and are read aloud with gestures. Solar eclipses put everyone in a reflective mood. Earthquakes teach a short course in humility with satisfactory exams. The city responds with processions, prayers, days of fasting, and adjustments to shelves. Here and there, someone calculates the date of judgment with great sincerity. When the day passes, the calculations are sold at a discount and used to wrap cheese. It is not cynicism, it is practicality, a virtue the city venerates right after the Trinity. Evening collects the corners. Lamps are lit by hands that know just when a wick should meet a flame. The basilica cistern accepts its reflection with the solemnity of a clerk. Filing water under permanent. In its colonnade, two Medusa heads carry their responsibilities at odd angles, which is exactly the amount of myth a reservoir requires. Above ground, a tailor puts away his needles in the small book where he keeps them. A baker wakes the next day's bread in a bowl that remembers last week's baking. A poet draws a fish in the margin of a sermon and is satisfied. A eunuch finishes the day's columns of numbers and closes the ledger with the sound of an eyelid. A cat patrols the street like a minor official with honest whiskers. Somewhere on the Marmara, a lantern moves the way a thought moves when it decides to visit sleep. You might not last a day here, which is not a condemnation. It is a compliment to density. The city asks you to notice everything at once. Loaves, laws, horses, icons, baths, bells, arguments, soups, rumors, weights shaped like birds, and above all the steady competence with which people live in the middle of it. Most visitors try to keep up until the city teaches them the correct technique, which is to let the details pass like a procession you can watch from the shade. If you have drifted by now, that is correct. The domes are cooling with soft clicks. The sea counts itself against the stones. The Golden Gate, having completed its shift, practices stillness for tomorrow. The lamps promise to stay awake until you do not, and when you open your eyes again, the bread will already be measured. The pigeons will have convened their committee, and the city will be midway through a sentence it began 1,000 years ago, still speaking in a tone that understands how to fill a room without raising its voice.